Welcome back, everyone, to Tell Me More Stories, Told as Podcast, the show where we uncover the fascinating stories behind everyday objects.
Fascinating is right, because today we're going deep on something you probably don't think much about.
That's right, we're talking about the refrigerator,
Yeah.
an appliance that we totally take for granted, but
Right.
has a history full of twists and turns.
Yeah. It's been a long road from, blocks of ice to the fancy fridges we have today.
Absolutely. And joining us to explore that road is someone who knows refrigeration inside and out.
Oh, I try my best.
So let's rewind way back before electricity.
Oh, wow. Okay.
How did people keep things cold back then?
Well, you have to imagine a world without artificial refrigeration.
It's hard to do.
For most of human history, people relied on nature.
Nature, huh?
Yep. Things like ice houses and ice boxes.
Okay, so like giant coolers, basically.
Yeah, you could say the insulated structures where people would store blocks of ice.
Harvested in the winter, or?
Yeah, or brought down from mountains.
Wow, that sounds labor-intensive.
These ice blocks were precious.
Yeah, I bet.
Meant the difference between fresh food and spoilage.
Well, especially in warmer climates.
Exactly. And there's evidence of these ice houses going way back.
Way back, how far?
To ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt.
So the quest for cold goes way back.
It really does.
But I also read about these ancient Persian structures
Oh, yes.
called yakhchels.
The yakhchel.
They were specifically designed for cooling, too, right?
They were ingenious, really.
So how did they work?
They were these large dome-shaped structures built partially underground with these thick walls for insulation.
Smart.
And they had a system of wind catchers and underground channels called qanats.
What did the qanats do?
They circulated cool air.
Creating a naturally refrigerated space?
Exactly.
So they were harnessing the power of evaporation.
And air currents.
Wow, that's incredible.
Pretty cool, huh?
It is, but those were more for storing ice, right?
Yeah, primarily.
When did we start trying to create artificial cold?
That's where things get really interesting. That quest really began in earnest in the 18th century with a guy named William Cullen, a Scottish physician.
What did he do?
Well, in 1755, he demonstrated that evaporating a liquid could actually lower the temperature.
Whoa.
He even produced ice.
So that's the basic principle behind how refrigerators work.
It is evaporation absorbs heat, which causes a cooling effect.
So Cullen was onto something.
Yeah, he was, but his experiment wasn't very practical for everyday use.
Okay, so it was a good starting point.
A breakthrough, but not quite ready for prime time.
So who picked up the baton after Cullen?
Well, in the early 19th century, an American inventor named Oliver Evans came up with the closed vapor compression cycle.
1805, right?
You gotta cheat. That's essentially the blueprint for modern refrigeration.
And that same principle powers our air conditioners, too.
You got it. It's all about manipulating the state of a refrigerant to absorb heat in one place and release it in another.
Makes sense.
Then just a few years later, in 1820, Michael Faraday, the British scientist,
Oh, yeah, famous guy.
he did experiments with liquefying gases.
Like ammonia.
Yep. His work really advanced our understanding of how substances change state and absorb heat.
So all these early experiments were laying the groundwork.
For practical refrigeration systems, exactly.
So when did we actually get the first working model?
Well, that big milestone came in 1834, thanks to Jacob Perkins, an American inventor.
You built.
The first working vapor compression refrigeration system.
Wow, that's amazing.
It's worth noting that Perkins was a prolific inventor.
Oh, yeah.
He also is credited with the first version of the refrigerator we know today.
Okay, so 1834, we have a working fridge.
Pretty much.
Why did it take so long for them to become commonplace then?
Well, Perkins's invention, while groundbreaking, had its issues.
Like what?
Early systems used refrigerants like ether or ammonia.
Those sound kind of dangerous.
They were flammable and potentially dangerous.
Oh, some safety kinks to work out?
Exactly, making refrigeration safe and reliable for everyday use.
It took a while.
Yeah, it required decades more experimentation and refinement.
But even with those challenges, people saw the potential, right?
Oh, absolutely, especially for commercial applications.
Like breweries.
Breweries, meat packing, those industries really stood to benefit.
From reliable cooling.
Huge benefits.
And this is where James Harrison comes in, right?
The Scottish Australian.
Yeah, he's credited with creating the first practical ice-making machine.
In the 1850s, revolutionized those industries.
Yeah, so even before home refrigerators, refrigeration was transforming things.
It really was.
But while all this was happening, wasn't there another type of refrigerator in development?
You're thinking of the absorption refrigerator.
Yes.
Around the same time, Ferdinand Garay, a French engineer, was developing that.
So how does that one work?
It was different. It used
Yeah.
a heat source instead of a compressor.
To drive the cooling process. So
Exactly.
it wouldn't need electricity.
That's right. It made it suitable for places where electricity was scarce.
Wait.
Ships, rural areas, even some early RVs and campers.
Wow, that's a side of refrigerator history I never knew about.
It's a fascinating story.
Yeah. So we have these two main types emerging in the 19th century.
Vapor compression and absorption.
But they were still largely commercial at this point.
Yes, for the most part, home refrigeration was still a luxury.
A luxury few could afford.
Exactly. But that started to change in the late 19th century thanks to a German engineer named Karl von Linde.
That name rings a bell.
He made major advancements.
Didn't he?
Yeah. Linde developed a more efficient and reliable compressed ammonia refrigerator.
And that paved the way for...
The development of home refrigerators as we know them.
Wow, so we're starting to see the pieces come together.
We are the journey from those early prototypes to the fridges we have today.
Filled with innovations and breakthroughs.
Absolutely. And we're going to delve deeper into all that.
After a quick reminder to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the rest of this deep dive.
So before we jump to the break, we were talking about Karl von Linde and his work bringing refrigeration closer to home.
Right, it feels like we're on the verge of like the home refrigerator revolution.
We are.
So who takes us across the finish line?
Who creates that first fridge designed for the home?
Yeah.
Well, that credit goes to an American inventor named Fred W. Wolf.
Okay.
In 1913, he invented the Dommelray.
The what?
Dommelray. It was essentially a cooling unit that you mounted on top of an icebox.
Oh, so kind of a hybrid of old and new.
Exactly, a stepping stone.
So what happened next?
Well, things started moving pretty quickly in 1914. Nathaniel B. Wales,
Okay.
an engineer from Detroit, developed a more practical electric refrigeration unit.
And did that.
His design ultimately led to the Kelvinator brand,
Kelvinator, yeah.
a name you might recognize.
I do. I remember my grandmother mentioning Kelvinator.
Oh, yeah.
But wasn't there another key player
Mm-hmm.
in those early days?
Mm-hmm.
Someone who kind of came up with the design we're more familiar with today?
You're thinking of Alfred Mellows.
Alfred Mellows.
In 1916, he developed a self-contained refrigerator with the compressor at the bottom.
Oh, okay.
His design really laid the foundation for that modern refrigerator layout.
Wow. So by the 1920s, home refrigerators are becoming more readily available.
Yeah, you start to see home refrigeration gain some real momentum.
Okay.
In 1922, two Swedish inventors,
Oh,
Baltzar von Platen and Karl Munters,
got it.
they introduced their version of the absorption refrigerator.
Interesting.
And Electrolux, a company that still exists today, commercialized their invention.
So it was a...
Global success.
Okay, so we've got electric refrigerators with compressors and absorption refrigerators, both gaining popularity.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like the 1920s was a big decade for refrigeration.
Pivotal decade, absolutely.
This is when fridges really started to enter the mainstream.
Yeah, and speaking of mainstream, we can't forget the iconic General Electric Monitor Top refrigerator,
The monitor top.
introduced in 1927.
Oh, yeah, I've seen pictures of this. They have that very distinctive look.
Right, like something out of a vintage sci-fi movie.
Yeah,
The design was inspired by the gun turret of the USS Monitor warship, hence the name.
makes sense.
GE sold over 1 million of them.
1 million units.
Yeah, they really captured the public's imagination.
They did. But weren't those early refrigerators still using those refrigerants that posed safety concerns?
You're right, refrigerants like sulfur dioxide or methyl formate were common then,
I mean, were.
flammable and potentially toxic.
Okay.
However, a major breakthrough happened in the 1920s.
This is the introduction of Freon.
Yes.
Now, I know it eventually had its own environmental problems.
It did.
But I remember reading that it was considered like a safer alternative at the time.
Freon was revolutionary. It was non-toxic, non-flammable,
Oh.
made refrigerators significantly safer for home use.
It's funny how often technological advancements come with trade-offs.
Right.
Like every solution creates new challenges, it seems.
Yeah.
So Freon makes refrigerators more appealing to the average household, but later on we discover its impact on the environment.
Exactly. The unintended consequences of innovation.
Right.
Tricky to foresee sometimes.
So what happened with Freon? How did we address that environmental impact?
Yeah. Well, as scientific understanding of ozone depletion grew, governments worldwide began phasing out Freon in the 1990s.
Okay.
They mandated the use of more environmentally friendly refrigerants in new appliances.
So that's why we have to dispose of older refrigerators containing Freon carefully.
Exactly. Responsible recycling is crucial damage to the ozone layer.
Okay, so we've seen the development of the two main types of refrigeration technologies.
Mm-hmm.
The introduction of safer refrigerants, the rise of the home refrigerator.
Yeah.
What happens next? Do refrigerators just keep getting bigger and better from there?
Well, not quite. The story of the refrigerator is far from over.
Giga.
Scale of constant evolution,
Footage.
new features, design changes, lifestyles changing.
Right.
And we're going to explore those exciting developments right after this.
So we were talking about the evolution of the refrigerator before we left off.
Yeah, and it's been a wild ride so far.
It has, hasn't it?
From those early models to what we have today, I mean, what were some of those key developments that really transformed the refrigerator? Well, one of the biggest game changers was the introduction of separate freezers.
Oh, yeah, in the 1940s.
Exactly.
I mean, that wasn't just like a convenience thing that completely revolutionized food preservation.
It really did. It changed how people shopped, how they cooked.
Especially in those post-war years with rationing and food shortages, I bet that was a huge help.
Absolutely. Suddenly you could buy food in bulk, freeze it for longer periods.
Totally changed how we think about food storage.
And it coincided with the rise of the frozen food industry.
Which also just like dramatically changed our relationship with food.
Yeah, it's amazing how these innovations just ripple through society.
They really do. And speaking of convenience, we can't forget about things like automatic defrosting
Oh, yeah.
and ice makers. I mean, this seems so basic now.
But game changers.
They were
total game changers.
Automatic defrosting in the 1950s liberated people from that messy chore of manually defrosting.
Right.
I can't even imagine.
And ice makers, wow,
Pure luxury,
added a whole new level of convenience.
right? It's funny how quickly we get used to these innovations and just take them for granted.
We do.
But it wasn't all about functionality, was it? Refrigerators went through some major style changes over the decades, too.
Oh, absolutely. In the early days, most fridges were white.
Plain white.
Pretty much. But then in the mid-1950s, manufacturers started experimenting with colors,
Oh, yeah.
introducing those pastel shades like pink and turquoise.
To match those, like, vintage kitchens.
Exactly.
So what came after the pastels?
Well, in the late 60s and early 70s, earth tones were all the rage. Avocado, green, harvest, gold.
I've seen pictures.
Then as we moved into like the 80s and 90s, we saw a return to those more neutral colors.
Like stainless steel.
Exactly, which are still popular today.
It's interesting how appliances reflect like those broader cultural shifts in design trends.
They really do.
But beyond the aesthetics, we've also talked about the different types of refrigeration technologies.
Right.
You mentioned the compressor fridges and absorption fridges. But what about things like Peltier refrigerators? Can you break down those differences for us?
Sure. So compressor refrigerators, those are the most common type.
Okay.
Using that vapor compression cycle we talked about earlier,
Mhm.
generally very energy efficient, powerful cooling.
Got it.
Absorption refrigerators, on the other hand, they use heat to drive the cooling process.
Okay.
They're quieter and can be powered by gas or solar energy. Off-grid locations, RVs, things like that.
Makes sense.
And then you have Peltier refrigerators. They use the Peltier effect.
Oh, just...
A thermoelectric phenomenon basically creates a temperature difference when you pass an electrical current through two different types of conductors.
Okay, so they use electricity, but they're not as common as compressor or absorption models.
Right, they are compact and silent.
So maybe good for...
Small spaces, dorms, offices, places where noise is a concern, not as energy efficient,
So each type has its own pros and cons.
depending on the application.
That makes sense. What about the layout of modern refrigerators?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we have all these different temperature zones and compartments designed for specific types of food.
Right. Well, modern refrigerators are designed to maintain specific temperature ranges for food safety and freshness.
Okay.
So your freezer compartment typically kept at negative 18 degrees Celsius or 0 degrees Fahrenheit.
To keep things frozen solid,
Exactly. And the refrigerator compartment where you keep most of your fresh food,
ideally between...
3 and 5 degrees Celsius or 37 to 41 degrees Fahrenheit.
That's a pretty narrow range.
It is all about slowing down bacterial growth.
Okay, so...
Keeping your fridge in that range prevents spoilage, extends shelf life.
Right, and then we also have those specialized compartments.
Like your crispers for fruits and vegetables.
Meat drawers.
Yeah, they help maintain those optimal humidity levels.
It's amazing how much thought goes into designing these things.
It really is.
But I think it's important to talk about that broader impact refrigerators have had on society, too.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, they've completely changed how we shop, cook, and eat.
The widespread adoption of refrigerators led to the decline of the ice trade.
Which used to be such a vital industry.
It was people no longer needed those daily ice deliveries.
And it paved the way for...
Supermarkets, the mass production of food, the globalized food system we have today.
It's a complex legacy.
It is.
with both positive and negative aspects.
Yeah, on one hand, we have access to fresh foods year-round.
Like if
It's also contributed to the rise of processed foods.
and food waste.
It's a tricky balance.
It is, but it's been fascinating exploring all of it.
It has.
From those ancient ice houses to these modern marvels with all the bells and whistles.
A long journey.
And it makes you wonder, what innovations are coming next? How will we address the environmental impact as we move forward?
Right.
What new features will we see?
Great questions.
It's amazing to think that something as seemingly simple as a refrigerator has had such a profound impact on our world.
It really has.
And it's going to keep evolving as we do a big thank you to our expert guest for sharing all their insights and taking us on this journey.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us on Tell Me More Stories Told As podcast.
We'll see you next time.
Until then, stay curious.